Well, here are, folks. Tuesday evening once again. I put the pre-show on just for a moment, and everything is running well here, more than I can say perhaps for the economy at the moment, bearing in mind what we saw today from the RBA. We'll talk about that shortly. Of course, as normal, the dogs are here, as you saw a little bit earlier on. They're all pretty relaxed. They might bark a bit. I'm expecting a parcel delivery at some point in the next hour, so we'll have to negotiate that, but that'll be fine. And of course, Chris is here ready to join us very shortly as well. And you can see the rest of the studio all set up there, still running, I think, as normal. And there is a lot to talk about tonight, of course, with the RBA's decision and some of the broader black cloth, some of the changes we're seeing in the property market, some of the changes incoming possibly at the budget. And I do think there's a big conversation to be had, particularly about mortgage underwriting as well, which, of course, Chris is spot on about. So that'll be quite fun too. Anyway, we've hit the 8 p.m. start time, so I'm going to take the pre-show off. I'm going to start the show. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening. Welcome to this live stream on the 17th of March, 2026. Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great you're on this evening. Thank you very much for taking time out of your Tuesday and spending it with us. Really appreciate it. Going to have a really interesting conversation this evening about property-related issues. So much going on, so many moving parts, and we need some help to make sense of it. So Chris Bates is going to come and join us in just a second. Just before I bring him in, may I remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice or property advice, general conversation only. Moderate the chat, but throw your questions, comments as we go. Use What the World DFA to get my attention. I've enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your question top of the list or indeed make a contribution around here. Appreciate all those who support us via Super Chat, via Patreon or PayPal. It really helps to make a difference. We don't do this for profit. We do this because it's a really important conversation we have, particularly now. And on that front, let me bring Chris straight in. Chris, welcome. Nice to see you again.
Martin's always good to see you. I can't believe it. Just, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6 months. I actually haven't checked when was the last time we chatted, but feel like I'm getting old. I've been doing these with you since I think 2018 or even earlier. And it's always good fun because it's always good just to sort of touch base, hear what you're hearing, and sort of give you my opinion on sort of what we're seeing on the ground as well. And as time ticks over, it's just always evolving the conversation, right? And it's an unpredictable world we're in, and a highly uncertain world, I would say, right now. And now how that interconnects into property decisions isn't as straightforward as sometimes people think. It's highly complex, right? And there's a lot of behavioral psychology that comes into it all. So. Yeah, how have you been? How's life over there?
Pretty busy, running my projects in Australia, of course, with the research, also doing the same in the UK as well. So I'm getting parallel results, which is quite interesting. And I can tell you that I think Australia is probably a bit ahead of where the UK is with regard to some of the property issues, but very similar thematics, high levels of financial pressure, high amount of appetite to get into the market if they can find a way in, government support, trying to encourage people to buy in, mortgage rates going up, the affordability pressure is huge, the rental situation very, very bad as well. So there are a lot of mirror issues. And I'm fascinated by the Bank of England, who's basically said, well, they were expecting to cut rates. They may not now cut. But of course, in Australia, the RBA has lifted rates, and we'll go into that in just a second. So there's a bit of a difference in terms of the monetary policy cycle, but the property market looking remarkably similar. And interestingly, property price rises were quite weak in the UK, but other than around London, where prices were very, very expensive, in the rest of the markets, there's still a bit of movement, so in the upward direction at the moment.
Well, it's a similar story here, to be honest. I mean, you've got some markets that are ridiculously low listings compared to, not just the last 12 months. I'm getting very frustrated with reports that even this week in the AFR, like, oh, listings are exploded. They're much higher than a week ago at this time, like 12 months ago. And was like, yeah, because it's Easter, and Easter's different. And like, of course it's going to be, and it's not every year's the same. Like, but if you can, you start to zoom out, right? And you look at 5 years, then you start looking at a city level, and you start looking at a house versus apartment level, and then you start looking at different suburbs and what's actually on the market. You need to go so much deeper. And I think if you look at some cities like Brisbane, for example, and Perth to this extent, like it's just ridiculous how tight those markets are. And how strong, how tight when you've got such low amount of people selling, and that's also causing price rises, and it creates that FOMO for the buyers. And then you've got this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that in the face of all this, going on, those markets have been performing, ridiculously strong, particularly in the housing market in those areas. But you're right, like in Sydney, Melbourne, different story. Hobart, different story. Canberra, different story. Darwin's on a whole other story altogether. And so, yeah, it's when you do break it down, and even Sydney or Melbourne has got different markets. You've got the sub 1.5 million market in Sydney, and sub say a million in Melbourne. That's beating to a different drum than is the houses at 2 mil, or the houses above 4 or 5 mil, or even the prestige house. So it's like, yeah, it's and everything's getting affected and getting driven by different markets. I think you've hit probably my major concern right now is around the rental market. I think that people sort of maybe underestimate just how important a sort of stable, secure, quite, we just need a lot of rentals. Like that's just the reality. A lot of people, just can't afford to buy, are going through a different stage of life, just haven't got the ability to buy, don't want to buy, shouldn't buy, you know what I mean? And so we just need a really, strong rental market that, is going to give them certainty that, their rents have gone up, depending on where you look at it, houses versus apartments or city, but you're talking 50% probably over the last 5 years. And so, if these people are already often those renters, yes, maybe they're in a fortunate position and they've been able to still save, but a lot of people probably haven't been able to save. And so, and not only that, with vacancy rates just where they are, like, that anxiety, even if you've got a rental, you're just like, your rent's going up and you feel like you just got to pay it because you just don't want to go to the rental market. And if you do have to go back into the rental market, you're just going to have to compete. And if your application's not, the best one out there, you're just going to get, thrown in the bin basically. And so that's just horrible. And I think that, that's a big thing that's just not getting spoken about. We always blame, prices, but we also don't really aren't considering just how bad the rental market is and how bad I think it's going to go over the next 2, 3 years, because you've seen a lot of new investors for the last 4 or 5 years go to regional locations. There's these newer buyers agents that are very good at marketing and very good at selling the dream, and they've been able to get an enormous amount of traction through social media over the last probably 4 or 5 years, and they've been able to basically capture anyone who's thinking about buying an investment property has been gravitating to this basically story that don't buy in the cities, buy in regions, higher yields, you'll get better. And basically, it's become this mini investment boom pushing prices up. So you're creating more rental supply in the regions, but it's fickle rental supply. Basically, those investors are there to make some money and often bring it back home and buy a house. So capital city, living in the capital city, buying in the region, they'll make the money. And when they think the time's up, they'll pull the money back out. And you've seen this mass exodus of people leaving capital cities. So I think it's a real issue. And I think with construction costs where they are, even everything that's going on overseas, we have no idea how obviously that's going to play out. But, it's not good. And, that's just, and investors aren't going to go anywhere near new property. Like they just have been burnt for the last 15 years on returns. And so I think it's an issue. And it's just going to get worse. And I think that's also a reason why people are so frustrated with house prices, right? Because if we had a very liquid sort of fluid, you could always rent, you didn't have to pay a crazy amount to rent, then there's pressure to buy is just not there. It's why a lot of singles and younger couples just don't really feel they need to buy. But as soon as they get to that family stage, they go, oh, I just can't afford to rent, and they get forced to buy. So that's a very long ramble to start us off here, Martin, but it's my biggest worry.
Well, I mean, you touched on so many important high points. And just to recap a couple of things, rental stress is as high as it's ever been pretty much at the moment. So A lot of people in the rental sector are
Yeah.
absolutely caught with cash flow. You're right. A lot of people fear having to move because if they move, they're going to have to pay a lot more. So they're actually being milked to an extent by rent increases for where they're living, but they've got no choice on that. And the supply of rental properties is pretty thin, and a lot of them, of course, are quite poor quality too. But also, I noticed that some property investors now are actively selling. And when
Yeah.
I did the calculations very recently, I made a show about it. I highlighted the fact that a lot of property investors are underwater from a cash flow perspective because whilst you might be seeing some capital appreciation in some places, the mechanics of money in, money out isn't working because there's a limit to how far they can push the rents up when the mortgage rates are going higher, when they're leveraged up. And so the property investing philosophy that underpins the property market for 20 to 30 years looks to me to be fragmenting. Now, I know that the government's encouraging the build to rent sector to come in and giving them massive tax breaks. Great for that. But of course, that's not going to solve the problem really in terms of the rental sector. So that's a big issue. I think government policy is partly to blame. And, I call this show the property game because I do think it is a bit of a game. And it's important that people understand the rules of the game, how the game is rigged, and essentially what it what it means for people trying to play the game currently. Because I don't think the way that the game is actually being played at the moment is transparent to many people. And what I'm finding is that people are actually making pretty bad decisions on not good information basis, still believing in the property game as a good game to play. But when you stand back and think about it, not everybody's a winner in the property game. There are winners and there are losers. And of course, we should just segue into that because with the RBA today did actually move the cash rate up by 25 basis points. They said that there was an increased inflation reflected great capacity pressures in the economy. And then they mentioned the Middle East. So the decision was not driven by the Middle East developments, but more by what's happened at this point. And they went on to say that there's growth in the demand in the private sector, probably stronger. But of course, public sector demand also growing. And she didn't want to delve into that in the press conference afterwards. Housing market was strong, but easing, moderating possibly now. Exchange rate quite strong. And there were lots of material uncertainties in the outlook and to what extent policy is restrictive. But she went on to say then that the decision was a majority decision, 5-4, that inflationary pressures did pick up. Inflation would like to remain above target. And so they're going to be attentive. So look, it was a bit of a sort of it depends story. But for me, it was quite important to understand. And by the way, consumer confidence continuing to tip down, according to Roy Morgan. And the latest future financial conditions, although it tipped up very slightly, is well below now where it was through COVID, which I think is an important observation, Chris, in terms of the background for people trying to actually make decisions about property. The expectation is that rates will probably go higher from this point. And those bigger mortgages, a lot of people are quite leveraged up, means it's going to be quite difficult from a financial position to manage through this. And yet, there are still people willing and able to buy, willing and able to sell. And so trying to separate the signal from the noise in this context seems to me to be very, very complicated. And I do believe that many people are making property purchase decisions on the wrong information base at the moment.
Yeah, so like you said, there's probably a lot to break down here. Let's go through it. So the people making property decisions, right? They're usually in three camps. They're usually first-time buyers, which I could ramble on for about half an hour around just how dangerous this 5% deposit scheme is and just how they're stuffed up there, which we will do. The upgrader market depends on the city they're in. Like in Sydney, Melbourne, like they're absolutely just really sitting on their hands. They can't find a house they want. They don't know if they can't borrow the amounts to make the jump. They don't want to because they're worried about where interest rates are going. So that market's frozen up. But in Brisbane and Melbourne and sort of Perth, let's just call it, and Adelaide, they are still there because they've done well on property. They still need to sort of want a bigger house, for example. But I do think that's going to run out of steam at some point, just due to affordability. But that upgrader market's probably still quite active. But the investor market, absolutely, like it's very high. Hence why APRA came in and said, let's increase these DTI caps. They we had zero exposure to all this, trust lending. Like, we sell the bank policy. We know what we can do with our clients. We know how to, if we wanted to go to non-banks and then go to trust lending, we could, but we could see the writing on the wall and we just don't agree with this. This is going to end badly. And so basically all the banks came out, Macquarie probably got into a bit of trouble and, then all the other banks followed, pretty quickly. And trust lending got shut down. A lot of these buyers agents were taking advantage of this basically unlimited borrowing capacity, which was all a bit BS, to be honest. And they were basically buying, lots and lots of properties in these regional locations. And Cookie, shout out to you. I know he's a big fan of this show. I always see his name pop up, but he made a really good point. If there's a bit of an economic crash in these regions, that's one big hit. But two, if the investors stop buying in these regions where they push prices up, the locals, A, won't be able to afford, B, won't want to buy, and then C, if they have got lots of choice, they'll just sit on the sidelines because there's no pressure for them to buy. And so you get this reversal effect in the regions. And so I don't think those investors know what they're doing. And a lot of the other investors, unless they're bailing now, they're bailing before everyone else bails. It's kind of called this greater fool theory. You want to get out while everyone else is sort of willing to pay these prices. It's that old sort of Price is Right when the guy's climbing the mountain. You don't want to wait till it hits the end of the mountain, he falls off the cliff. But the past investors got burnt. Like, let's be real. Like, the investor lending's been getting tighter and tighter and tighter since 2014. Like, you can borrow nowhere near the amount. And how much an investor can borrow is a huge driver of investor loan growth. It determines how many investors in the market, how much borrowing capacity they've got, what assets they can consider. And that's been really, really tight. And so a lot of these previous investors got pushed down off the plan apartments and got pushed down sort of a multiple property approach. And a lot of them are going, well, yeah, I'll bail. And then also the ones who have bought good investment properties, maybe they bought a house in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Perth, and they bought it, 2010 or 2005, and they just held it. They're getting they're actually getting to their 50s, 60s, sort of 70s now, right? And they're saying, well, the yield on this is just after taking costs and land tax and blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
my net amount in my pocket is just so minor versus if I sell it, yeah, I've got to pay capital gains tax and pay an agent. But, there's a bit of hassle managing a property as well. And people just get over it over time. There's like investment property management fatigue that sort of kicks in. And it's fine when you got a good tenant and then you get a new tenant in and then they ask you to fix the aerial and, the cooktop's not working, etc. And it just gets a bit too much. So those investors, I think, are bailing. And so, yes, you've got 3 million investment properties, but yes, you've got all these new investors coming that are going to regions. But if you're not basically filling up the rental properties in our capital cities, and then you got on this top of uncertainty around negative gearing, uncertainty around capital gains tax, etc. And so, yeah, I think that's a real issue with the investor. It looks on paper there's a lot of investors out there, but it's not going where the old investors went. And they're not going to be going back into the capital city. So you're going to see this continued rental crisis. And we're not building anywhere near the amount of new accommodation, right, compared to our migration. So, due to what our shortage is. The first time buyer thing, which I mentioned, look, the 5% deposit scheme that came out in October is by far the most advantageous scheme I've ever seen. It's increasing the caps, removing any income limits, basically meant that it was for everyone. And a lot of states have got stamp duty concessions, as well. So 5% deposit and you can enter. The caps are at a level where pretty much every first-time buyer should be able to buy under those caps. And that's brought forward demand. It's reactivated old demand. It's got parents wanting to help the kids because they hear about the policy. It's kind of creating these little mini boom markets in the first-time buyer market. And I do think that the investors that have gone who haven't bought are now going, well, do I buy in Melbourne, for example, under that sort of cap and try to buy where the first-time buyers are going? So you're creating like this little demand hotspot. And I do agree with you. There are increasing pressures out there. There are a cohort that have, got mortgages that are feeling quite tough and they've got job uncertainty. But, just like COVID, just like when interest rates went back up, all in 2022, so we're talking 4 years now, they had to ride that wave, and they're trying to continue to ride that wave, and they're doing everything they can to keep their homes because they don't want to get out of the market. But I do think that together with everything that's happened over the last few weeks with just oil basically, and just this cost of living and uncertainty, I do think it's really pushed them another level. And so I wonder how that's going to sort of play out.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of uncertainties, and we'll perhaps get on to the conflict shortly. Just a couple of data points, which I think is quite interesting. This was from Cameron Kushner, and he actually highlighted the fact that based on the latest APRA data, the rise of high LVR lending has risen, and also the rise of interest-only lending, particularly for investors, has risen. And, interesting question. Does that mean that APRA needs to do even more in terms of actually, restricting the capacity of lenders to lend? But your point about the trusts and the way they've turned that right down is quite significant. I've had a couple of conversations with property investors who were planning to use that route and suddenly found they couldn't anymore. And of course, it was giving them greater capacity to borrow than you might think. On the 5% deposit angle for first-time buyers, if property prices do begin to move down a little, and it's possible that they will, given everything else and the conflict and everything, that's a problem because that limited equity that they've got gets squeezed. But I'm worried more about the fact that they've borrowed more to start with, because of course they've got a bigger loan. And the rate of interest on some of those loans, according to the analysis that I've done, is a little bit higher than obviously a lower LVR loan. So they're actually paying a bigger cost on a bigger mortgage at a time when some of these economic pressures are looking like they're coming through. So I'm really concerned about how many people from those first-time buyer loans are going to actually find that things are going to get quite uncomfortable in the months and years ahead.
I probably wouldn't align with that one. And why I would say that is, borrowing capacity is probably only about 5 times income now. It's way tighter than it was, say 5, 6, 7 years ago. You are right. They pay a slightly higher rate potentially, but it's not always the case. All the banks, there's a lot of competition in this sort of, government scheme, and it's a very marginal difference. I don't think that's a big point. I do think that they are basically buying all the properties often that a lot of the investors have bailed on, over the last 15 years. So the apartments, for example, in sort of Brisbane and Melbourne, just because that's all that they can afford. A, because of borrowing capacity, and B, because of sort of city limits. Melbourne, not as much because they can still get into the housing market. And if they do get themselves in a bit of financial stress, then, there are usually other options. And, they do sort of first-time buyers, I think they get not enough credit, if I'm honest. Like, I think people sometimes, don't think they're savvy enough, or they don't know what they're doing. Like these, a lot of first-time buyers are buying when they're circa 30. Like, they're not 18-year-olds and don't know how to save. And just due to the way the borrowing capacity work, it is moving up the income spectrum more and more. So yeah, I don't think you're going to see the arrears rate on these loans dramatic higher than other loans. I don't think you're going to see that this massive equity issues. They're not going often into the danger zones. They're going in and buying, places to live in. They're, often the capital cities. The issues they are having though is building issues. So basically they're buying into a lot of old apartments with massive building issues, and that can absolutely wipe them out. A special levy on a building that they didn't do enough DD on, is absolutely a huge risk. And so that would be my major concern with these first home buyers, is they're taking advantage of the scheme, but then they go and buy a poor asset. And just because of building costs and this lack of new stock coming on the market, it's sort of pushed up the price of poor assets, because the replacement value of these assets has sort of increased a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. It's the same as sort of the house and land package. Like, technically, if building prices didn't go up and the cost to produce land didn't go up, then you would just find that there was more supply. But, a lot of these house and lands, you've just seen building prices have gone up. The house was 300, now it's 450 to build. Well, everyone's house is gone up. It usually depreciates, it's gone up. And, the cost to produce the land has also gone up. And so the the next and the next lot of housing estates is a smaller block because they're trying to keep it, and so that also makes yours a bit more desirable. And so, um, yeah, I don't see a major issue there. I see a major issue in the regional markets where investors bail, and then they flood the market. And I wouldn't say first home buyers are typically going there. Um, and yeah, that would be the where I see a huge issue, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And, I've had a few conversations with first-time buyers who've done okay, but other ones have been caught with these bigger strata fees that are suddenly jumping out of
Yeah,
nowhere. And then the quality of the property that they thought they got is not the quality that they've actually got. And so suddenly they're finding that they've got this extra drain. And in fact, there was some statistics from the ACT I noticed that the biggest reason why people were actually getting into financial difficulty wasn't the mortgage payment. It was actually those increased strata fees, which came out
yeah.
of left field. And I think that's quite worrying because, of course, what it means is that if, in fact, people can't pay those strata fees, then the work can't get done, which means that the quality of the asset deteriorates even more. So it's a sort of it's a bit of a doom loop, really. So I think that's a really important point. And Cookie says, well, you need a capital gain to really break even. So I don't know whether it's 9% or what it is, but the point is, a lot of people haven't done the maths to start with. The other interesting observation, and just talking about another segment, I don't really saw this article, but there was a thing in the Fin Review the other day talking about the millennials who are now facing a retirement with a mortgage still. So effectively, they got a bigger mortgage later. And so for many of them, the exit strategy is to raise their superannuation at or around retirement to pay the loan down to be able to actually hopefully survive post-retirement. I think that's quite an interesting observation too. I don't know whether you've had much exposure to that cohort, the people who are buying properties or trading up later, but are banking on effectively being able to pay their mortgage into retirement.
I'm not sure if I'm getting my day trial. I don't think millennials are 55 yet, are they yet, Martin? I'm a millennial. So I don't know millennials at 55 worrying about paying their super. I must be getting old. I think it's probably more a Gen X sort of story, right?
Well,
I do think
this
getting
was
a lot of debt into retirement is absolutely going to be either paying your mortgage off at 50 and and then taking advantage of superannuation and then just retiring just isn't going to work, right? Like even trying to pump too much money into superannuation, we all know, even just the taxes all went through a couple of weeks ago. But I remember when I started in financial advice, like how much money you could put in under concessional, like tax deductible contributions. It was 100 grand. It's not 30 grand. It is today, basically, right? And you can put heaps more money, and you can have huge amounts in there tax free. And so that's just going to get tighter and tighter and tighter. And so I think putting money into super, yeah, absolutely, it's a good strategy, but it's maybe not just something you can fall back on, and you use it or you lose it. There are some catch up rules there, but I think this whole desire of sort of getting a place and then having it paid off, just isn't going to be the case. I think people are going to be forced to downsize. And while you might want to say, oh, they want to stay living there, but I think people, have been able to in the past. And it's actually one of the problems in our housing market is that people haven't been forced to downsize in retirement. They've been able to live in these houses that don't really suit their current needs. They're empty nesters. They've got, a lot of spare bedrooms. And who's us? It's not really our place to say, hey, you need to sell that place. If they can afford it, they can afford it, right? But the tax system is structured in a way that there's no incentive to downsize. Why would you? It doesn't affect your pension. It's still growing for you tax free. It's a great store of wealth. It's a great place to live. So, I do think you're going to find that people are going to get to retirement still with debt. And I do think the younger generations have got a different view on that. And I do think you're going to see 40-year loans. I do think interest-only loans are going to come back. I think there's going to be a deregulation of what we've seen, just because at the moment, like it's really hard to sort of get a 30-year mortgage on a place that you're going to live in and then pay it off. And so the system's going to innovate. You've sort of mentioned this, in our chats. You've been always surprised that when you think that the market's sort of going to go to the sword, the government steps in and pulls it out, right? And does something that you're not expecting, with COVID and payment holidays and, the list goes on. And, this is just another way that they will, keep the system going is that they need to be able to create new debt for the next buyer. And the intergenerational wealth in the market is enormous. A lot of people sometimes misunderstand the structure of the housing market, and they think everyone's like them. No, it's not. Like you've got a $12 trillion housing market with say $2.5 trillion of debt, $10 trillion of net equity, and a lot of homes are sort of paid off. A lot of homes have got, LVRs, debt's very, very manageable. And you have got a cohort that's got sort of bigger mortgages, but they're often the people who can afford those bigger mortgages or have got access to family wealth. And so, and you can see that in the arrears rate. And so I think you've really got to try to break down suburbs, and understand that, okay, interest rates are up. Okay, great, but who does that affect in that market? What and you don't buy the Australian property market, you buy one or two properties out of 11 million dwellings. Like, it doesn't really matter what happens to Australia. What happens matters to those properties that you own. And so that would be my sort of takeaway for a lot of people with these is just to really understand the sort of the wealth within the suburb and how it is all structured and where the danger zones are. Like
Mm.
often they're in the busier streets and the poorer aspects, and they're the ones who are holding the more risk. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've always said go granular. That's one of my mantras. And I did some research the other day on St Mary's over in the west, near Penrith. And superficially, people were thinking, well, that looks quite an interesting market. But when you look at it, the planning and rezoning that's been done recently has really completely changed the characteristics and the property market there, because people are now being able to put higher rise properties and multiple units on those plots. And what it means is that effectively, unless you do the research there, you actually don't know what you're buying into. And I've seen a few people get caught a little bit by essentially assuming that how the property has been in a particular area is going to be the same as the property market is going to be looking forward, despite the fact that these government planning changes, which are now coming through big time across the country, are really significantly changing the characteristics of the market. So I think it's really important that people do their due diligence and understand the dynamics and understand the change of planning and all of those things. But it's quite complicated for people who've not thought about it before, because, well, really, generally people don't buy lots and lots and lots and lots of properties. They might buy a few. And so maybe there's a interesting observation there that people assume it's simple when it's more complicated.
The planning thing is absolutely the story to be following. And it's the one story, if I think about the Elephant podcast, Veronica's very frustrated, probably frustrated with me. She hasn't said that, but I'm just obsessive about it, and it's for me to understand just how big this change is.
Yes.
Got Paul Scully on next week. We've had developers on. We've had site acquisitions. We've had architects. Like we this is a huge shift in Sydney. It's also in Melbourne. It's also in Brisbane. It's also in Perth. And the status quo of what we thought the NIMBYs and the power of the way that they were, basically, restricting supply in the city is really changed. How it plays out over the next few years is hard to know. When you talk about sort of same areas, I'd be a little bit less concerned that you're going to see this flood of apartments in the current market. Just the feasibility of building's really hard. And so what you're finding is that where the developers can still make a profit is due to these planning controls in places like Mossman. When I talk about Sydney, Double Bay, Rose Bay, Edgecliff, Bondi, up the North Shore. I mean, it's some crazy stuff happening along that northern train line in Sydney. And you're literally talking houses, trees that are basically turning to 6-8 level apartments. In a residential sort of heritage zone. It was like a protected sanctuary within the city that nothing really was ever changing there since for decades. And now all of a sudden you're going from this to this. There's no middle ground. And Melbourne, they're changing the town code. It's even more pro-development. They're from apartments to townhouses to duplexes. It's way pro-development down there. And so you've really got to be careful with that, because what you thought was a safe bet 2 years ago isn't a safe bet potentially in this market. And you need to overlay that into your decision. If you're going to go and buy an asset that you're going to hold for 10, 20 years, you need to sort of try to think through, well, as the city evolves, and we're not going to go and open up another, Melbourne or Brisbane or Sydney. We're going to grow our population. They're going to go somewhere. They're probably going to go to these capital cities, and we're going to have to house them. And where are they going to go? And so you can start to think about, and all the investment they're making in, things like the metro. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that there's going to be a lot more densification in our cities. But not every piece of land's equal. Not every piece of land is what a developer wants. But so the people who are going to make the money is potentially the ones who, have got the high quality land that developers are going to be able to put together and make money on it. But there are going to be people who lose out in those suburbs, who haven't got land that, developers want, who are affected from a livability point of view, and potentially from a property point of view. Like, is the livability of the suburb changes dramatically? Well, that was baked into its price. If that's no longer as attractive to a subset of the market, then they won't want to buy there for that price. They'll go to an area where they can get a better lifestyle for that money. And I think that just the structure of the city is going to shift, if Chris Minns continues on this journey, and we do see these policies get more and more embedded. But it's absolutely a story people need to be understanding. Whether you're buying or whether you own a house in any city, you really need to start to be aware that more density is coming, and how would that be a good thing or a bad thing for your assets?
It certainly means that the characteristics of those suburbs are changing quite significantly. And of course, it's following the money, right? Because effectively there is federal money available to the states if the states can meet their housing targets, and the housing targets are about numbers, not quality or anything else. So the quickest way to actually meet the numbers is to build up, and that means that they're going to change the zoning, which means, of course, they get money from the federal government. So you can see how the money machine works. But you're right, individuals need to actually understand whether they're actually looking to buy in, whether they're currently in a particular suburb, or if they're thinking of escaping before it dramatically changes. Because if you walk around some of the suburbs that I recall from 20 to 30 years ago and compare where they are today, they are completely different. They've got high rise, high rise, high rise. And by the way, some of the planning changes, of course, means you don't need a garage. You don't need so much light. You don't need such large spaces within which to live. So you've got the concentration of families and people living together. The other point I'd also highlight, and this is the thing I get quite hot on the collar on about, noise, because noise in some of these high-rise developments is really, really severe. The you can hear everybody around, and I know that there are standards, but those standards are not very high. And the quality of construction, again, is a problem. So one of the things I always say to people, if you're looking at buying in a high rise, go and walk around the high rise, not just when they show it to you on a Sunday afternoon when it's quiet, but also check it out in the middle of the week as well, or in the evenings, because the noise levels can be quite high.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been pockets of, cities that have, been very pro, and there's industrial land, white roofs just go on your satellite and Google, and you'll find all these pockets that, yeah, and you can just see it's just going to build out tower after tower after tower. If you think of somewhere like, depending on what city you want to talk about, but Kangaroo Point in Brisbane, or, Docklands in Melbourne, or in Sydney, or Epping, or St. Leonard's, or, all around the airport, etc. So there's always been those. And, people, I think, were aware that there's what's more coming. I think the shift that's happened is due to the low to medium rise and the TODs with the metros mainly, and a lot of the train stations, is those regions are going to expand, massively, where before they were just houses and very hard to get a high-rise development approved. They're spreading particularly into these pockets. And you're right. And, not only is it noise when they're finished, they're noise to get built. And, if you've got no guarantee what's going to get built around you, you've got to be very careful what you buy. If you're buying into these, do you really want to live through this site? Like, and I don't know. I haven't really finished my sort of thoughts on it all. Like, I think there's definitely a product that probably could be sort of built and sold, and they're building premium products to be fair, Martin, it's not the same as 2015. Just the cost to build and the ability for a buyer. They have to basically find buyers that have got a lot of cash.
Mm,
And so it's a lot of the downsizer market and or the family market, not even yet, to be honest. And they're going to move from their house. They want it all. They want the space. They want, the lock up. And so they're wanting a real premium product. I'm not sure how many buyers there are. This is sort of the next level is trying to really understand how much is the buyer depth for this. So you could rezone, you could make the feasibility there, but is there enough people and there's a profit for developers, but is there enough buyers to be able to, satisfy the amount of demand that's coming? Because there's a huge amount. If you look at somewhere like Rose Bay, Double Bay, and even just places like Mossman, like is there just enough buyers that can be paying 3, 4, 5 million for apartments? I don't know. I'm just doing a bit more digging on that. And there's been a lot of sites that have changed hands. The houses that are banded together to sort of list and that are going through because you get much better uplift if you do a bit of affordable housing. If your estate significant development, you get through override the councils a bit, and there's a bit going on there. But it's a huge story.
mm.
And if you are owning a house in a capital city, is definitely try to get some good advice there. Would be my advice.
Yeah, and check the zoning and the plan zoning and all of those things, because sometimes the communications from the local councils is not great. It's like, surprise. Suddenly, did you know you can now put 6 stories up next door? And of course, the other thing that I'm seeing quite often is that existing property owners are clubbing together and deciding to sell together so that they can actually dispose of a bigger footprint of land to a developer, and then that allows them to go up higher and make more money as well. So there's a whole bunch of really interesting and important points there. And as talk the talk, very good, I like that name. It says soundproofing, yes. What about waterproofing? There are some issues with some defects, particularly around waterproofing. Although I agree with you, some of the more recent properties are actually because they're more expensive, because they're not targeting the really cheap work. They're actually going up market a bit, like on the Gold Coast, for example. The cheapest apartments are $1.5 to $2 million, which is not really going to help affordability for ordinary people. But the quality of the construction, therefore, is somewhat better in places. But again, I have seen recent examples where the quality of the construction is still pretty suspect. And I want to come back to the noise issue, because I think the noise issue is a biggie. Now, there's another issue I wanted to touch on, because there's a lot of discussion at the moment, specifically about the advertised price guides. And there's an article here, New South Wales property sellers will be forced to advertise their price guide, and real estate agents who break new underquoting laws will be fined. They say the new laws will stop agents from advertising a sale price lower than a previously rejected or written offer. And fair trading will police it. In Melbourne, of course, Victorian home sellers forced to disclose sale price in underquoting crackdown. What's your take on all of this, Chris? I've always had the view that underquoting is a real thing, but it's about policing it, and I'm not sure whether this will actually make a lot of difference. What do you think?
I mean, I do think it's a step in the right direction. I don't want to be negative, but agents will all be basically trying to figure out how to play this, because there's a lot of, it's one of those things where when you're a buyer, you hate it, but when you're selling your property, you want those tactics that they're using to push the price up. You want that because you want the best price for your property, because you need that because you're going to make other decisions. And so everyone can be quite hypocritical, I find, with this, is that, and even when they select the agent they often hate working with when they're buying is often the agent they end up selling with, because they know that they did such a good job for their vendor. And so the other thing I think agents also get a bad rap sometimes, that, they are also part of a system and a game that, that they're kind of forced to play. And yeah, they could go and do another job. Like, I get it. Like, that's the thing. But if you are and that's your passion and that's what you want to do. And you're trying to contribute to, your family and society, right? Like it's really hard to be the agent out there that, is the one that is trying to play the straight bat, I guess. The straight back with the vendor is really hard sometimes because a lot of vendors just want to hear that their property's worth more than it is. It's just a natural behavioral bias. We all value things that we own more than they're worth. And and there's a lot of anchoring bias and what you think it is, and like there's so much that goes on there, right? And so the agent's dealing with a vendor often who thinks their property's worth too much. That's just the truth. Secondly, if they don't tell them that, then another agent's going to go in and tell them that, that their property's worth what they think it's worth, because then they'll most likely go with that agent to sell it. And so they're kind of, if they're the agent, they're saying, no, it's only worth 1.4, and every other agent tells them 1.5, they go, well, you don't believe in my property. I'm going to give it to the one who thinks 1.5. But they're just overquoting it because they know once you've got a sales agreement with you, then they'll just slowly work you down through the campaign and say, well, the feedback from buyers is 1.4, sorry. But they know they've already got you signed up. Their fee's not related to the. Then secondly, like, because the market's already misunderstanding this sort of price guide, like if they do the opposite to the other agents, so all the other agents are saying, right, I'm going to potentially put on a lower price guide to create more interest, to create more social proof, to create more people to the open home, to create more awareness, even though I know that it's going to sell much higher. Well, then the agent who doesn't play that strategy, who says, well, I'm going to put it on at 1.4 and everyone else is doing 1.3, then they get less competition. They get less people interested. They get less people through the open home. A lot of buyers think they're playing the same strategy as other people and it's going to sell for 1.5, 1.6, and they're going, well, no, it's actually a real price. And so basically the whole system's built that's actually not working. And so it's not often, there is absolutely cases where the agents bend it to the next degree. And they sort of play this game. So yeah, I think sometimes people are just blaming the agent, but it's actually the system's just a failure. Hence why they're coming in and doing these reforms. It is extremely frustrating, the whole price gate thing. A shout out to a pretty good app. I'm sure people on here is an app called Homer. You can sort of download it in your Google extension, and it sort of back ends into the real estate portals, and it gives you access to the price guides and the story behind the property. And that transparency that app gives you is amazing, because that's the transparency buyers should have. They shouldn't have to play this guessing game of what is actually going to sell for, and trying to find out the price guide's really hard. And I noticed that I haven't touched the reserves, which is a bit interesting. Like that's a bit frustrating. It's like, okay, so you put the price guide this, but that doesn't mean they're going to sell at that price. And you could go to auction and they could just want a lot more than the price guide. So do we go into that situation? But there's also going to be some tactics, buyers agents and buyers are going to have to pivot. Like, if you have like a written offer, like, are you better off just to, on day one of a campaign, put in a huge written offer that, they're probably not going to accept, but then they have to update their price guide. So you basically force the agent to take, updating their price guide, whether that works or not. There's going to be all these different strategies that come out. But agents need this sort of smoke and mirrors.
Chris, I'm just going to get my parcel. Property. You keep talking. I'm just going to get my parcel. Okay.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I'll just keep talking to myself, Martin, and I know you'll probably be nodding away in the background if you were here. But no, there is this sort of smoke and mirrors game for people who are watching, where it is sometimes hard to sell property, and if you're the sort of, that's the buyer, you hate it, right? Because there's no transparency. But if you're selling that property, that, unless they do that, you're just not going to sell this property. They have to, create a feeling of scarcity. You have to make the buyer feel that if they don't buy, then, they're going to miss out. They have to, and that's why I would never want to be a real estate agent. You just basically have to lie the whole time, to basically motivate buyers sometimes to take action on properties when, they know, the agent would know that there's no competition, and that, this probably is not going to sell for anywhere near the price. And they're having to try to get this price achieved by getting one, sometimes two buyers to work up. And that smoke and mirrors thing's just part of the game.
I'm back.
Very good, Martin.
Yeah. It was dog food.
Watch that back later. I'm sure you will.
Um, now, the really interesting developments here, is we're seeing more intervention by state governments into the property sector, and as you say, some of it's to do with the fact that they know it's broken. The fair trading authorities have some authority, but not a huge amount. And I always think, well, what about the leaders within the real estate industry themselves? Why aren't they taking a more proactive stance to dealing with some of these issues? And another example, this is actually one from Melbourne. Victorians putting a property on the market may soon have to pay for the building inspection in a government push to save buyers time and money. Now, of course, and I know that today a lot of agents actually have reports that are really part of the marketing program for the property, and they don't really tell you a huge amount. What's your take on this? My perspective has always been, it sounds good in theory, but in practice, I'm not sure it's really going to get to the heart of the defects of properties.
Look, I think it's like different states have got different disclosure requirements. Some are pretty relaxed and very vendor, and buyers often have to make very quick decisions on very poor amount of paperwork, and it makes really buying quite hard fast. And so then you're basically stitching buyers up. Like, you want to be the buyer that does the DD, but the rest of the market's not doing the DD. So you have to basically play the game, and you have to basically skip that step, because if you don't, you're not going to buy. And so I do think there has to be some type of minimum requirement for all the documents to be there. And that needs to be sort of a very high level. But whether they then need to start providing building and pest reports, like, I don't think so. That's a disaster. If you think that there's independence between the building inspector and the real estate agents and the vendors. And, I kind of keep going on to this. Like, if you've got a property that has a lot of building work issues, like, that, right? That that's something and often a lot of sellers are dealing with that. It could be water, it could be, issues with the land, it could be the roof, it could be the walls, it could be and these are big issues. If buyers are, really concerned and understand this, they won't buy it. And, unfortunately, the property market's unregulated for a lot of reasons like this, is because, it's what keeps it turning over. And so I know they're putting some regulation here around the building pest. That wouldn't be enough. You'd be doing your own. The amount of times I've seen agent building and pests, and you go and do your own one, and it's like chalk and cheese. They're completely different reports. And it's highly conflicted. I'm not trying to say building inspectors the dodgy ones here, and they should be, but like, there is a pressure on them. They need business. A lot of the agents would give them the business, and there's just this, conflict there. So get your own building and pest. You employ them, you pay them a fee. And it's frustrating, and over the cost of buying, you might miss out on a number of properties, but at least because if you buy a property and even if you don't have you just miss one thing and it costs you $5,000. Well, that's paid for all your building reports. Let alone if it stopped you, a $50,000 or $100,000 mistake because you didn't buy a prop. It stopped you buying an absolute dud. So even if they offered it, I wouldn't do it. I would go and have my own independent.
Yeah. Well, I started out my career in the building surveying industry. And so I know what a proper building inspection looks like, right? And I know that the amount of time it takes to actually go through and do the work on a property. And okay, you can speed it up by getting some of the standard clauses as some of these processes now use, and they use AI and things. But if they haven't done the work, if they haven't looked in the voids and everything, you're never going to see the problems, right? And so many of those vendor reports basically are caveated by saying, I couldn't look here, I didn't look there, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, but the property's fine. And then when you come to actually, pick up the property. And by the way, it's not just older properties, even some more modern properties, as we said earlier on, can have defects. So I agree with you. It's really important to get your own report, not least because you can hold them accountable subsequent if in fact there's a big issue that pops out the woodwork. And unfortunately, sometimes they do. As Cookie Boy says,
well, it's more than you want. It's the new
Yeah,
ones are the biggest issue. They're the ones that, they've been standing the least amount of time and they should last the longest, but they're often being built the poorest.
yeah.
And it doesn't mean you have a blanket thing with the old properties. Absolutely not. Like
Mm,
they're getting on now. A lot of, you're seeing a lot of issues in, older apartments, yeah, in brick houses and, they're getting, it's cost to fix things is not cheap, right, Martin, nowadays, right? And so you've got to be extremely careful because I think that's a lot of the risk when people are buying property. They're having to act fast because they're acting on very limited information. They're missing out. It's highly emotional. Like I think people completely underestimate this, how stressful it is and how the market just puts you into this tailspin when you're buying. Investors can be, I was in control, I knew what I was doing, I don't even think that either. But, home buyers absolutely are whipped up in this sort of market. And, it's sort of like pressing, domain real estate, even if they're not, even if buyers agents, it's a hard job. Um, and, they're having to make quick decisions and assess properties. And, there's an ideal what they want to achieve. And then there's reality. And, they're having to, and then there's this property comes on, there's a lot of competition, they've got to act fast, and is it the right thing? And they've got to do the ZD, and then they miss out, and then maybe they should went hard at the auction. And so and then you've got the relationship side to it, and pressure with timing, whether it's a baby or kids or schooling, or they're selling something, or the market's moving, and they're not acting rationally. It's just not true. And it's really hard to be sort of through that process because sometimes you have to meet the market because if let's say valuation is a real issue, like people burn time by, they don't meet the market where they have to pay to buy. They don't want to pay. They don't think it's worth it. But they just never meet the market and they never buy because they just don't ever think that. And someone else pays it, and then all of a sudden they're having to switch suburbs and types of property. And so um, yeah, I think that DD around buying assets is a huge issue because a lot of people just haven't got big buffers, and they've got higher mortgages, they've got no buffer left over, and then they have to pay all this money just sunk costs into a property because they didn't do that DD. It can really wipe them out. A, the property's not nice to live in. B, they potentially couldn't live in it. Then they can't sell it. Then they've got to fix it. It's one of those mistakes that can really wipe you out, I feel, if
mm.
you get it wrong.
Absolutely, I'm afraid I've seen it again and again, unfortunately. Now, another mistake that we've had reports recently, CBA reported $1 billion worth of fraudulent mortgage applications, and that's prompted the question about to what extent people are actually telling porkies or not in their applications. And I know that's a complicated and difficult issue. What's your take on all of this? Is it a big issue? Is it not? I mean, we've had some of the banking analysts claiming that up to a third of applications have lies on them. What's your take on it?
You get me in trouble answering these questions, Martin. Uh, Look, I think I'm not commenting on the CBA case, or I'm not going to comment on, individual banks or what's happening. Um, I do think, it's not me thinking this, but there's been massive issues with introducer loans, which is basically referred loans into internal banks. NAB had some major issues with this. This is other reports have highlighted this. I do think you're always going to have issues with bank staff and giving them potentially too much responsibility to basically be able to approve loans because a lot of them are on a salary and a bonus structure, and the incentive and there's a lot of KPIs within banks to write products. The stickiness of, you got your bank account, get them a credit card, get them some life insurance. The more products you can sell, and a home loan, absolutely is one of the products banks make the most money on. So I do think there's issues within that. Uh, yeah, like individually, like lying on applications, there's definitely been issues in, broking as well. Like absolutely, brokers haven't but there's just a lot of checks that go on, with the broking channel. Like it's not like, Ninja, no income, no loans. There has been a bit of a rise of low doc loans and sort of non-bank lending and sort of that trust. Like there's definitely some issues there at that type of lending, but just you know, just stereotypical loans through the banks. It's you're not like unless you're fraudulently changing pay slips and like it's not really the case. Are there sort of small lies around the edges on applications that, you know, are you might think they're material, but in a bank size they're not massively material. Um, I think there was a huge case with Westpac and Shiraz around living expenses, and that solved that major. That was a massive issue back in sort of 2015 to 2019. Um, but like a banks do a credit check as soon as you lodge an application, so they know all your debts. They know whether you're missing repayments. They've got your pay slips and your bonuses. They've got your business financials. Like there's just so much checking that happens. And so I don't think there is. I don't think that there's this big, huge issue of, loans in the market that have been, and $1 billion in a $2.5 trillion home loan market. Like, is it really? Like, it's the same thing you made around that build to rent point. Yeah, people can talk about build to rent as much as they want, but there's 11 million dwellings and there's 50,000 apartments in pipeline for build to rent. Like it's a drop in the ocean. And so um, I don't think it's like this systemic issue. But I do think, banks particularly just due to the nature of being responsible to their shareholders and driving credit growth and the competition in that sector is fierce. Um, and particularly when they're actually flipping now because they've lost the war to brokers, they sort of and I think they've lost it because they didn't look after their customers. They basically was restricted with general advice, and then two didn't really add value beyond just setting up products. And the broker market basically did a lot of adding value to customers, and bit by bit, when I started, it was 35% market share. It's 80 now, and so 80% of loans go through brokers. So banks have, consumers have spoken. And so banks are now, have lost that war, I guess, and they're trying to bring it internal. And it's failed. It's failed for the last decade. They've tried mobile bankers, but it's just there's a better proposition for customers. And so, yeah, I don't think there's massive issues in the broking world. I really don't. And but I do think you've got issues within banks trying to write loans themselves. And yeah, you could get me in trouble for saying that.
Well, we'll try not to. But I mean, it is worth observing that they suggested that the AI tools are now so sophisticated that they can produce fraudulent documentation much more
Oh,
easily than previously. And I've seen a few examples of that over the years as I've done projects where I've looked at bank applications for mortgages, and when you actually dig into some of the information that's been provided and you sort of scratch the surface, you think, oh, that's a bit interesting. I wonder whether somebody looked at that sufficiently well. So, it's a complicated process. There's a lot of checking that does go on, but I do think there are some gaps in the system. And I think that the AI story has really, well, maybe out evolved. We'll see. I guess we'll see.
well,
Chris,
that's what kind of
yeah.
leads into it though. Like, say for brokers lodging that,
Mm,
like they're risking their livelihood. If they
yes.
get caught, they basically get delicensed, and who knows what else where that ends up, right? A bank staff member might just get the sack. Like and it might even not get reported on because it doesn't look good for the bank. And so I think that's one of the issues is
Mm,
that I think when you've got people in an industry it's just built on different fundamentals. And I think that's I mean I'm a little bit pessimistic because I worked at two banks over in the UK and I saw some pretty horrible things and in the financial advice world. And I sort of try to I've sort of and I've seen that play out time and time again. And the Royal Commission happened for a reason, and I don't think those issues are going to go away
mm.
when you're trying to push credit growth within banks, and yeah, rather than through the broking channel. I don't think it's the major issue.
Okay, very interesting. Now, two issues before we tie the ribbon on this. First one is a simple one. I had a question actually sent to me before the show from Manny, and Manny was talking about buying property off the plan in the current environment. And I was be interested to get your take. This was a home land package, effectively off the plan. Builder not that well known, but it checked out. Um, and I guess the question is, if you were in that sort of journey at the moment, one, would you go near it? And two, what are the questions that you would want to table if you were going to go down that particular route?
We're not really a huge fan of buying new. Like, and we it's one of those ones where, and I understand why a lot of people do. And I know that it's often what people can only afford, and so it's not me. I just sort of from the fundamentals of what makes a good asset, often it just doesn't tick the boxes. Scarcity of land, highly desirable, the high quality land with even within that estate or that apartment block, and then the risks of the builder going under, the risk of, more supply coming. You know, I just don't think they're great assets often. There has been this sort of, you know, they've been saved. I said it earlier on around the building prices going up and the land values up. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, it's actually pretty good. And maybe it pays off over 10, 20, 30 years. And it looks really good in this last 5 years, but that doesn't mean it's going to continue. Building prices have gone up a lot. Like, there's a lot of issues like, house and land, not as much. I think there's a really, you know, it's a good sort of system there around these builders, I would say. The apartment market does seem to have a lot more issues, I would say, than the sort of house and land. And even the sort of smaller townhouse market, I don't think has as much issues. And you see some major issues in developments getting delayed, builders going under. It's just a lot of risk on those projects. Defects can be bigger. And often you see massive oversupply rather than these sort of these house and land packages. There's only a small number of builders that can do this en masse. The people who are cutting up these land lots, there's only a number of sort of developers can do this en masse. They control supply. There's a lot to learn about. Even though there's a lot of farms, they don't flood the market with lots of land. And so they're sort of strategically letting it out to making sure that they can make a profit on it, basically. So I don't think you see this massive oversupply. I mean, there has been times when they've stepped more into the investor market. You think about what happened in Perth for the last 15 years. A lot of people got burnt going into there. So be really careful if you're going into those market as an investor. If you are going in for a home buyer, just see if you can buy something a bit more established. Like would be my advice. Like I know you like that new kitchen, but it won't be new for long. And design change extremely fast. And often, they're having to cut costs somehow, whether it's materials, whether it's, and maybe they didn't a couple of years ago. So if you could just get something a few years ago, but it's a better product, a bit more land, you've found out that, you don't have to worry about the builder risk. Just maybe do that. Yeah, it's not brand new when you move in, but I think you've just saved a lot of stress, and potentially got yourself a better asset.
Yeah, tends to be my recommendation too, because I'm afraid that some of the things I've seen with some of the new stuff is pretty horrendous. And of course, builders fail, and you end up with a half-finished project that you then have to find somebody else to finish it, and that can be quite expensive. And of course, sometimes the financing goes off the rails at that point too. So yeah, I think there's a caution, is what I say. Danger, Will Robinson. Now, the other final question we need to touch on before we finish is, I made a show actually about it, markets, households and business all held over a barrel. We have the war going on in the Middle East at the moment. How do you think this is going to intersect the property market in Australia? And will people look through it, or will they be forced to effectively change their strategy or negotiate around it? Does it depend on how long it goes on for? What's your take, Chris?
This is obviously a huge concern. And it depends, I feel, on how knowledgeable and how deep you go into the rabbit hole on it, and how, I guess, and what information you read, and how you think this is going to play out. And no one knows how it's going to play out. I know these are not what people want. People want to know, oh, what's actually going to happen? No one knows. Like, that's just the truth. And things can turn on a dime. And what happens today could change tomorrow, given what's happening. You know, I think I try to get an understanding if this is going to be a really long-term issue with sort of oil and, is it going to be a short spike and does it, and a long-term futures and around oil. I'm not an expert in this stuff. I'm trying to learn about it and trying to be curious with it, but I do think it brings uncertainty, right? Obviously. On top of all the changes with sort of AI and maybe we'll think it's buzzwords and things like that, but I play around with it a lot, and every day it is improving, and there's huge benefits and improving, and it's going to have massive impacts in even our industry and broking, in lots of industries, and so that together with this, together with interest rates, inflation, it's just a very uncertain world, which is what I started on.
Mm,
And so what does that, for the property market, what does that mean? Okay, so first home buyers, I think they're just going to ignore all this. Is that they're in a rental crisis, they want ownership, they've got a hugely attractive scheme from the government, and they know that if they wait, there's going to be an opportunity cost. The government said it's not going to affect prices. Like, download the Quartality monthly report. Look at the bottom 25% of capital cities. Look how much they've gone up since October. Like, it's 10% potentially in some cities. Like, it's absolutely pushed prices up way more than what Treasury thought. Maybe at a collective, maybe it doesn't affect things as much, but where first home buyers are buying, it absolutely creates little mini booms. And so first home buyers, I think, will kick on. I do think you're going to see investors a little bit less apprehensive. That you're going to run out of these like new investors at some point. They've been very hungry in the market. A lot of people feel like they missed the boat because they went to they didn't go to these regions early enough. But they feel like they're entering the party quite late. They're quite nervous on going somewhere like Melbourne. And they want to sit on their hands and wait. So I do think investor lending will probably dry up a little bit. I do think you'll see but I do think you'll see some investors sell, which might see some more listings. But I think a lot of what the investors are selling and first home buyers will be buying. And then the housing markets will just freeze up. Like, it's March now. Obviously, these things are moving in time. There's going to be no listings till Easter. Like, you just don't list your property now. Easter will come in 2 weeks. Then you've got the school holidays, so like middle of April. And if you were going to try to list your property in sort of late April, May, you would sit on your hands.
mm,
Like, why would you want to list your property in late April, May with everything that's going on? You would just sit on your hands another 3, 4 months and see how this plays out. And so, I think that's my gut is when see is total listings across the country is already ridiculously low. The turnover rate, how long people are living in their homes is lower and lower. And so that's really our supply of properties is really how much we're building and how many people are selling. Like, it doesn't really matter. There's 11 million dwellings. It's like, what is actually trading? That causes it's the marginal buyer. And I think you'll see that it's just another year of freezing the market up, another year of really low listings. And even if we sort of get some answers there, like, I think it's one of those ones that you'll want to see time till that confidence is rebuilt. I think it's pretty scary for a lot of people. Imagine if you're living overseas around the world and you've got a family, like, has this reassessed your plans around being an expat? Do you go, do we just move back to Australia? Does Australia almost become more of a safe haven, for wealth? Like, do we? So there's all these other things that, could come out of this, that will have all these second and third order consequences that people may have not have thought about. Whereas you might just think on the tin, war, all prices are going up, inflation, property market's going to crash. Like, that's how you could build a story like that, and that's what the media will do. But
mm.
it's way, way, way deeper than that. And what happens to how does it affect buyer demand? How does it affect seller demand? What parts of the market? What are some of the other things that would play out? That's the things that you sort of want to dig deeper on. But if I think about the action people should be taking, if you've got a mortgage, you absolutely need to be taking advantage of a liquid credit market and the ability to access credit easily, because banks are absolutely risk on. Like, they will lend you as much as they can possibly lend you due to restrictions with how much they can lend you. They'll give you cash out up to the maximum they can give you, assuming you've got the equity. They'll redo your loan terms to 30 years. So you've got amazing. Now, the rates aren't great at the banks. So you might not refinance for a better rate, but you should refinance for a better loan structure. Because the thing that gives you personal satisfaction or confidence satisfaction to peace of mind and comfort is knowing that if I lose my job or something massively happens in the economy, we're okay because we've got these big buffers. And so definitely review your lending strategy. And that's not a push to come and work with us. Absolutely, we'd be happy to help. But the opportunity is investors. I'd be really careful. Like there's only a certain number of investors that have got really strong borrowing capacity and really good equity. And they may enter the market, particularly if they see there's a bit of an opportunity where they can buy better assets because the buyers are a bit freaked. But it's a very small market. So I don't think it's going to see this huge investor boom. But people upgrading, you can see this as two ways. You could say, glass half full. I'm confident at some point, there'll be more certainty. And if I wait for that, there could be an opportunity cost. So even though there's more uncertainty today, I know that that's going to reduce competition. I know that listings are really tight. I could wait, but I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to be one of those buyers that rock up that's a bit more confident. They may be able to get good assets at fairer prices with this, and then we're going to take on that get that or that benefit of that uncertainty. But I think most upgraders will do the opposite because they're not. They've already got a house. They will want to sit on their hands, and you'll just see listings really tight. But if you are in that upgrade account where you think that that there is actually some better buying on the higher price points in the capital cities, they're the ones that have just been stuck on with the handbrake on because of borrowing capacities, and so you are finding that particularly in some sub markets that you can get pretty good deals for if you're the buyer that's ready to go and ready to buy. If you've got a vendor potentially is a bit spooked as well. So agents also play into this, which is they'll be using this war as a reason to motivate vendors to sell, and then on the next phone call they'll be saying, hey, there's an opportunity to buy. And so if you've got a spooked vendor with a buyer that is more confident, you could find that they could potentially take advantage of this uncertainty. And I'm just being real with that as well. I'm not saying taking advantage of the war, obviously, but that's just the way that the property market works.
Absolutely. And interface that for me, if you could, with the budget up in May, when there's a prospect potentially of the CGT and negative gearing rules changing. And I'm thinking that that's going to be another pebble in the pond, which could create some more ripples in the property market, overlaid the ones we've just been talking about.
Yeah, on that. So, that's there's all the 80 odd submissions to the government. I thought it was today, actually. I think anyway, it might be tomorrow. Obviously the government's going to come out with their views on all those submissions, etc. And I think that will be interesting to sort of see how they sort of respond. Look, what that is targeting investor lending. They're basically saying that we've got all these issues because of investors. They're easy to throw under the bus. We said it was foreign investors. Now we're saying it's investors. It's not the truth. And if you're saying that out there in society, just do a bit more digging, because I think what you're realizing is that there is a reason why investors are needed in the market for our rental supply. And, they're not bad people. There are people who leverage the system dramatically and bought heaps and heaps of properties, and you might think that that's, too greedy, etc. You can have that, but that doesn't mean that the person who's got one investment property is just, a bad person. They're just trying to do something for their future. And so just be careful how you sort of handle that person. That would be my view, is try to be a bit more knowledgeable there. But how would that policy impact? So absolutely, it's anti-investor, right? So as if you were going to buy an investment, you need a higher rate of return if you're going to pay more tax. And people would be less likely to want to invest, because particularly if they went for negative gearing as well, because they would say, well, so that would absolutely affect our rental market. Secondly, if you are buying in an area that needs really strong investment demand to sell and trade property, because it is one of those market like high density apartments, then this would be a policy that's anti that market. But if you're anti-investor, you're actually pro home ownership. And what that means is that someone who's got equity in their home, who may be in a position to buy an investment property, they will say, well, I can't put more money into my super. I don't want to buy investment properties. I've got borrowing capacity. I'm going to upgrade my home into the sacred lamb and get a house growing tax free. And so what you'll do is it doesn't mean you'll kill credit growth. You'll just push people more down home ownership. And that is kind of the, on the assets that people really want. Like they don't really want to buy the investor stuff. They want to buy the houses. And so if you push the incentive, change the incentive from here, you'll change the behavior, and then all that money will just, to be honest, flow into houses, and to the properties that people are really frustrated by in terms of the prices. And yeah, I don't think it's going to cause this massive market crash. I do think some markets, particularly where there's, and you can easily do it. Look at the census, look at the owner-occupier rate within a suburb. Look how much rental stock. You'll see that obviously a lot of those suburbs were 70, now they're 80%, now they're 90% driven by owner-occupiers. And an easy way to think about that is that every time that 1 in 10 properties come on the market that is actually an investor, it's probably a 90% chance that that'll go to another homeowner, because the investors aren't buying within these. It's gone past what current investors can afford. That investor bought it 20, 30 years ago. They paid that price. New investors have to pay current prices. It's going to go to an owner occupier, or it's going to a developer, and then they'll build for the owner occupier market as well. And that's not really an investor. So yeah.
Yeah. So I've had the view for some time that unintended consequences will follow. And I'm not necessarily convinced that the headline news about, yes, we're actually for the first time buyers against the investors is actually the full story. So I'll be reading some of those submissions with interest and try and make sense of it. Chris, we've pretty much come to the end, I think, of our time. If people want to find out more about you, where is the best place for them to go?
Alcove.com.au, Alcove. That's it. Thanks, Martin. And yeah, jump on in there. We've got a team, obviously, and you chat to probably Ali or Sandy or Jack, depending on sort of what your sort of plans are. And, we've got a whole strategy team that's, come from an accounting, financial planning background that will, they just love the numbers and figuring out what's the right structure in the bank. And my role within the business is more around helping clients make decisions around property moves, together with their lending decisions. So not acting as a buyer's agent. That's we refer to a whole heap. If people are interested in that, I got a podcast called Street Secrets, which haven't really pushed out there a lot now. It's something that I'm just sort of building the database on. We've got First Home Unlocked if you're a first home buyer. Australian Property Podcast every Sunday with Pete. That's always good. I always love doing those, and obviously got the elephant in the room as well, which is always just my it's kind of my love to be able to get anyone not anyone, but people like you, Martin, on the pod and ask questions and have discussions. And it's ability for me. If I don't understand this part, we've had things on aged care recently and this intergenerational wealth transfer and a lot around the YIMBY movement. And it's just me and a lot of economists and people that probably wouldn't go for a coffee with me, but absolutely would give me an hour of their time to go on a podcast. So the Elephants is a good sort of resource as well.
Absolutely. Well, I always refer people to that particular podcast. It's the mother of all podcasts when it comes to the range of people that you have, and I always enjoy participating personally, but also listening to some of the other ones, and some of the recent ones, particularly on those aged care scams. Pretty much, I think was frightening. So that's I recommend that as well. Chris, I want to say thank you so much, and really appreciate your time this evening. I think a perfect time for having this conversation. And I'll look forward to picking up the conversation with you again down the track. Who knows where we'll end up with all the things that's going on at the moment. But I think that the takeout for me is simply this. Don't be swept away by those headline news items about the property market's booming or it's crashing. The truth is property is local. It's a local game. You need to understand the dynamics locally. You need to understand how things are moving, where you're thinking of buying or selling or what you're doing. And then make sure you do your due diligence on the way in, because if you don't, you get caught later. And unfortunately, the thing that I find in my one-to-one conversations, Chris, is a lot of people make bad decisions because they don't follow the process that is required. And there are people out there who can help. So appreciate your time, Chris. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you, Martin. It's always a bit of a stretch getting me on at 8 o'clock during the week, 2 young kids, and but no, I always enjoy it, and I appreciate the invite. And yeah, good to catch up with you again in the future. Thanks, Martin.
Take care. We'll take you offline, and you can go to bed. Cheers.
See you, mate. Bye-bye.
There you go. I hope you found that interesting, informative. And I think there were some really important points there from Chris tonight. So thank you for that. Just to say that next week, there will be another show, and it'll be Tony Lacantro, actually. We're going to be talking about market dynamics and some of the recent things. So that should be fun. The dogs are sort of half here. So the other one is by my feet saying it's lunchtime. Come on, get on with lunch. So that's the story there, but we'll look forward to that. Check out my recorded shows, particularly at the moment. In fact, I'm making a special recording with Damien Klassen tomorrow, which will go up tomorrow, talking about the market dynamics, because things have so much morphed in recent times and so much uncertainty. So we're trying to cover some things there, and I'll be making more shows each day over the next few days, but it'll be live next Tuesday. So thank you for taking the time out to spend it with us this evening. Thank you, Jason, for your super chat. Really appreciate it. As always, it really does help to keep this show on the road. So thank you for that. Have a good evening, and we will see you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Take care.